Hi, this is Simon Black. I'm actually in New York City today. I'm back in the land of the free and just had a wonderful weekend here in the city. Something interesting happened to me this morning. I'm staying actually in the St. Regis Hotel, pretty fancy hotel on the Upper East Side. I had the meeting that I was attending was here, and most of the members and guests were here. And I walked downstairs this morning. And there's a bunch of guys in suits and sunglasses with, weird, electronics coming out of their ear, and they're talking into their wrist. And I thought, uh-oh, I've either entered the Matrix, which maybe I have, or there's some of these dignitaries and big bosses around. Well, it turns out the second happened to be true, and the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, was around. His presidential, vice presidential limousine with a big seal and all that stuff was outside. And all these the place was just crawling with Secret Service agents, and there were all these other dignitaries there and people with the little pins in their chest to signify what country they're from, and limousines outside with flags and so forth. And I thought, God, this is so ridiculous. I mean, what sense does it make? We honor these people with position and privilege and title, and all the ass kissing and everything that goes on. This is sort of obsequious, because there's a politician around, and these people have. I mean, these people have this long-term track record of incompetence and deceit, and I just don't understand how it makes sense that they're treated with. There's so much gravitas surrounding these sort of big boss events where there's politicians involved. I just don't understand this, because these people, everybody just universally agrees almost. The approval ratings and all this stuff just shows nobody has any respect for these people, and yet they're treated with so much respect, and their track record. This is just the objective data tells us that they run the economy into the ground. They try and centrally plan everything, and they ruin lives, and they wage war, and they raise taxes. How does this merit any respect? I just don't understand. And it was kind of funny because, again, all this is, these are data-driven conclusions. It's nothing against the man or the woman or the personality involved. It's just, if somebody were the CEO of a company, and the CEO of the company were, managed to rack up record stock losses year after year after year, they'd get fired, and they probably wouldn't be treated with so much dignity and respect and so forth. But politicians are in a class of their own, and this is insane. And the reason this was sort of so ironic is because I've been thinking these deep thoughts about this, about, again, looking at objective data and imagining this situation because if I was walking downstairs, which I was, and if Joe Biden happened to be walking around, which he was, and if he had kind of pulled me inside and said, "Hey, Simon, I need your advice about something. If you were me and you could be in a position to destroy your entire banking and financial system, how would you go about doing that?" And I'd say, well, gee, pretty much exactly what you're doing now. And this is a hugely important thing, because right now the U.S. has, for now, the biggest and most important financial system, banking system in the world. What you may or may not know, and I hope you enjoy this slide as much as I do if you're looking at our slideshow, you may not know, let's say right now there's a Chinese manufacturer. Let's say somebody owns a factory in China. They're making widgets or little toys or whatever, and they're selling this stuff to a Brazilian merchant. Well, the money flow generally doesn't go directly from Brazil to China in order to pay for this stuff. The money flow would go from Brazil to New York, and New York to China. And the reason for that is something that they call, corresponding bank accounts. Because most of the time, in order for these, two companies in two countries to conduct transactions with one another, there has to be sort of a medium in between them in order to be able to do that. And so what happens is that the Brazilian company, again, they would wire funds. Let's say it's a $10,000 payment. They would send funds from their Brazilian account, from their Brazilian bank, to New York. Because what happens is their Brazilian bank has an account at one of these big banks in New York, Bank of New York Mellon, Citi, J.P. Morgan, etc. And it just so happens that the Chinese company, their Chinese bank, has an account in New York. And so what happens is that New York is the place where that process kind of clears, where the funds go from Brazil to New York, and then from basically the New York account back to China. That New York is sort of the translator between those two companies and those two different countries. And so without that, this is the way it's been for a really long time, for decades and decades. people have always had sort of a center of these transactions clearing. It's been London in the past, it's been Paris and so forth, and for the last several decades, it's been New York. The big Wall Street banks are critically important in conducting transactions around the world. Also because many of those transactions happen to take place in dollars, where you get some of these countries, you've got a guy in Albania, doing business with a guy in South Africa. That's pretty much going to be done in dollars, maybe euros. But most of these transactions around the world are done in dollars. This is why they call the dollar the reserve currency, and because New York is the largest financial center in the United States, and the dollar is the #1 reserve currency, settlement currency, transaction currency in the world. That's what makes New York the biggest and most powerful part of the entire global banking system. A contract to sell oil from Saudi Arabia is priced in dollars. Again, this Brazilian and Chinese businesses, these transactions are priced in dollars. When when the government of Botswana issues sovereign debt, they'll issue it in many cases in dollars. And so this is what makes the dollar very important. This is what makes the U.S. banking system so important, is because there has to be, sort of a dollar-denominated system in order to process all of those transactions. And so that's why, New York is so powerful, but they are literally going out of their way to destroy it. Like I said, if Joe Biden walked by and asked, what's the best way for me to destroy our banking system? It's exactly what you're doing right now. This is what they're doing. The only reason that all that system really stands is because people have confidence in it. It's convenient, it's already an establishment, and people trust it. They trust in the banking system. They trust in the dollar. They trust in the U.S. government. And yet, again, the government and the system and everything, they're going out of their way to destroy that confidence. And I'm going to explain a couple reasons why. One of the ways, if you want to destroy your banking system, the first thing you need to ensure is that your banks are poorly capitalized, right? Good banking systems, right? If you want to enhance your banking system, you have well-capitalized banks. If you want to destroy your banking system, you have poorly capitalized banks. We've talked about this before. There are a lot of banks in the United States. Some really big banks, like Citibank, failed their Fed-mandated stress test. So what does that mean? It means that in the event of a financial shock, Citi would not be able to withstand a financial shock and still be solvent. They wouldn't be able to make it. They would go under. They would go bust. They would go bankrupt, right? Well, markets generally have a short-term memory, but I bet people probably still remember what happened back in 2008 and 2009. I mean, all these big banks, they had to be bailed out by the government. They had to be bailed out by the government. They were about to go under, and you can understand now why that's such a big deal. Again, because of this system. Because if Citi went down, then the Brazilian merchant wouldn't be able to pay his Chinese manufacturer. It wouldn't be able to happen, and so people looked at that and said, "Whoa, wait a minute. We trusted this banking system to be liquid and to be solvent, and it turns out it was a lie. It was a scam." And they came out. The banks got bailed out by the government. They got bailed out by the taxpayers. They got bailed out by generations yet to be born, because all that was done with debt. And what happened? They said, okay, well, we're fine now. Never, never, never again. They've been borrowing money at 0% from the Federal Reserve, recapitalized and said it's never going to happen again. Never, 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 never again. And then what happened? They failed their stress test. They failed their stress test again. So after they already said, hey, never again, that was only a couple of years ago. And now just after a couple of years, they're in the exact same position where they say, oh, well, easy come, easy go. We failed our stress test. Not to be outdone, the FDIC, which is supposed to back up the banking system, right? It's supposed to ensure all the deposits. Turns out the FDIC is inadequately capitalized. There's a law, the Dodd-Frank, this Dodd-Frank law that was passed, was supposed to clean up the financial system. As part of Dodd-Frank, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, is supposed to maintain in its insurance fund at least a minimum amount of money, and they can't even maintain that. The amount that they're required to maintain is required by law, and the FDIC can't even make that. So you got these inadequately capitalized banks and this inadequately capitalized reserve fund. And then there's this new thing, actually, that came out of, there's a city in Switzerland you may or may not have heard of. It's called Basel. It's kind of an interesting place if you've never been there. It sits on the German, France, and Swiss border, basically, so you can go for a run in 3 countries in like 5 minutes if you want to. Kind of cool. But anyways, Basel is a place where they have met to discuss bank liquidity and solvency requirements, and you hear these things called the Basel Accords. and Basel requirements and so forth. And every now and then they come out with these new requirements in the financial system that banks should maintain certain levels of liquidity and solvency and so forth. And there's a new thing out they call the supplemental leverage ratio. It's just another measure of a bank's solvency. This one goes a little bit further in ensuring that a bank is actually solvent. You kind of want a bank that's insolvent. Again, insolvent banks are usually very dangerous. And it turns out, so the FDIC actually just released this and said, well, we do have this requirement and we need to maintain this. They call it supplemental leverage ratio. Again, just another measure for solvency and liquidity and overall bank safety. But it turns out, you know what, we're not going to require you to actually maintain these minimums, at least not for several years. Because, of course, if they require them to maintain this level of solvency, the minimum level of solvency today, none of the banks would make it. None of the banks would be able to make it, so they're not even going to require them to meet that. Not only they're not going to require them to meet these basic levels of solvency, they're not even going to require them to report it. So they just said, ignore reality, stick your head in the sand. A couple years from now, pish posh, who's going to care? So again, you got this, these banks that can't meet basic liquidity and solvency requirements, an insurance fund that can't meet basic liquidity and solvency requirements, and ironically, it is that inadequately capitalized insurance fund that has the power to regulate the inadequately capitalized banks. I mean, how's that for irony? But this is the banking system. This is the banking system in the United States. So if you want to destroy your banking system and you want to destroy confidence, remember, it's all about confidence. People have confidence in the banking system. You want to destroy that confidence, the first thing you should do is be poorly capitalized. The second thing you should do is destroy your currency. That's an easy one. You want to destroy your currency. This is one of my favorite charts here. If you're looking at this one, this is, of course, the objective evidence. You don't have to go very far on the internet. It's not even in the dark corners of the internet anymore. It's out there every day. People, you see these headlines, they're destroying the dollar and all that stuff. And yeah, that's all fine and good. But what does that actually mean? I don't think a lot of people really look at sort of the data to try and understand what that means. They'll show sort of graphs of federal government debt. And okay, sure, that's interesting, but that's not necessarily the direct correlation to the dollar being destroyed itself. What really matters with the dollar, if you want to get to know the dollar, you need to get to know the dollar's issuing authority. Who issues the dollar? It's not the federal government. It's the Federal Reserve. If you pull out a dollar in your pocket, let's see, I got one right now. It says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. It is a Federal Reserve note. This happens to be one with Mr. Ben Franklin. I didn't even know. They must have changed these. This is a new one. Kind of interesting. Obviously they want to prevent counterfeit. It's like, I don't know if you've seen these new hundreds. It's sort of greenish blue instead of the old sort of dark deep green. Obviously, they want to prevent counterfeit and just ensure that the federal government can do the counterfeit. The central bank can do the counterfeit, as that individuals can't do that. Anyhow, this is a Federal Reserve note. What that means is this is a liability, essentially, of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is responsible for issuing these and not necessarily the Department of Treasury or anything like that. And so if you want to get to know the dollar, you have to look at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a bank. It's what it is. It's not a, it's not UP. It's not Coke. They're not doing facials and makeovers in there. They're responsible for managing the money supply. This is their ridiculous charter. It's 100 years old now this year. For 100 years, there's been this tiny group of men and women. It used to be men, now it's men and women. Doesn't really make a difference. They're all central bankers, and their job is to manipulate the currency. This is the dumbest thing in the world, to just award totalitarian control of the money supply to a tiny handful of people, and we just expect them to be good guys, right? It's just ridiculous. And you look at their track record and you say, okay, you look at the sort of the same capital requirements, right? We're talking about capital. This is essentially, it's a balance sheet. It's assets and liabilities. It's the equity, right? What is the net worth of the Federal Reserve as a percentage of its assets? It's not much. And you can see it here in this chart. They've gone from over 4.5% to, as of today, it's 1.3%. It falls almost every single week, and the trend is down. You can see this massive erosion in the central bank's balance sheet since this crisis started. It just gets lower and lower and lower. The lower that goes, the more destructive the consequences to the dollar. The dollar is a note of the Federal Reserve. It is a liability of the Federal Reserve. When the Federal Reserve slips into insolvency, and this isn't even on a, oh, that's a major faux pas. Sorry, guys. This isn't even a mark-to-market basis. This is just at book value. This is just book value, right? And their book value, they're practically insolvent. On a mark-to-market basis, they are insolvent. If the Fed's insolvent, it makes the dollar utterly worthless. Let me put it to you like this. If I'm broke, okay, and I go out and I issue a bond, right? I issue an IOU and say, hey guys, loan me money. Here's an IOU. How much is that piece of paper worth? Nothing, because I'm broke. I'm broke. I don't have any money, right? If I don't know, Bill Gates goes out and he issues an IOU, you know, how is that worth more? Yeah, of course. It's probably actually worth what he says it's worth, because we know this guy's the richest person in the world. As the Fed slides into insolvency, those dollar IOUs become less and less worthy, and we can see this. This is just objective data. It's one thing to say, oh, the dollar's worthless and so forth, but this is we can actually see this. We can actually see it. We can see this line decline more and more every week when they release the H41 report. We can see this line, this decline. We can see the trend unfolding before our very eyes. If you want to destroy your banking system, destroy your currency, destroy your central bank. The other thing you can do is use your credit rating agencies for political gain, right? S&P, Fitch, and all these guys, these are the ones that go out and tell us that, you know, this country is credit worthy. You know, France is, you know, the A+, and the United States is this, and China is this, and Germany's that, and so forth, right? So if you want to completely destroy your financial system, rating agencies are a big part of the financial system, because investors go in. If S&P says something is AAA, then investors go, oh, it's risk-free because S&P said it is, right? S&P said so it must be AAA. And that's it. And then they have entire investors that line up and buy AAA rated stuff simply because S&P says that it's AAA. If S&P decides to downgrade somebody, then everybody wants to sell it and say, oh, it's not worthwhile because S&P downgraded it. So if you want to completely destroy the credibility of your rating agencies, then you use them for political gain. So what happens? All of a sudden, S&P downgrades Russia. You know why? Because it's obviously it's political favor, because there happens to be a huge standoff right now over Ukraine between Russia and the West, and so everybody's sanctioning Russia and so forth. You know, Russia is actually a reasonably wealthy country. Russia actually has physical, tangible wealth and so forth. This isn't I'm not necessarily recommending anybody invest in Russia right now, but Russia doesn't have $17 trillion in debt like the United States, $17.5 trillion in debt like the United States does. So it's amazing when you look at S&P would say, okay, well, yeah, the United States is fine, but Russia we're going to go ahead and downgrade. This is a political tactic, and they're using credit rating agencies for purposes that go far beyond the actual rating of credit. This essentially eliminates the credibility of the credit rating agencies. So if you want to destroy your financial system, you completely eliminate the credibility of this important component within the financial system, that being the credit agencies. The next thing you want to do is you want to kick out other banks. You want to be exclusive, not inclusive. That's how you destroy your banking system. You say, you know what, other banks, we're not going to let you in anymore. If we go back to this chart again, where we've got, this one somehow flipped. Sorry, guys. This should be the Brazilians on the left and the Chinese on the right. Obviously, I got a little carried away here. You can probably forgive me for this one. But we're talking about, money going through New York. You've got a bank in Brazil and a bank in China that each have an account. So just like any other customer, they have an account at a bank in New York. In banking parlance, again, they call this correspondent banking, sometimes interbank, the interbank system. Or between banks, they actually call these special bank-to-bank bank accounts. They call these nostro accounts. So, a bank in China that has an account at, let's see, JP Morgan, for example, they would call that a nostro account. It's an Italian word, nostro, meaning ours, as in that's our money. That's that's the Chinese bank's money. It just happens to be sitting in the bank in New York. Well, what's happening right now is you have all these banks in New York that are literally kicking out other banks. J.P. Morgan, for example, which is one of the largest interbank, they hold more of these Nostro, they hold a lot of the, not more of them than any other, but they hold a lot of these Nostro accounts. A lot of the interbank lending, the interbank bank accounts are actually held at J.P. Morgan. They're held at Bank of New York. These are some of the largest ones. And J.P. Morgan has actually said, we're going to freeze this right now. We're not going to allow any new customers, and we're actually kicking out some of our old ones. So they have, for example, the largest bank of Dubai was just kicked out, just lost its Nostro account in New York, its corresponding bank account. And they're kicking out a lot of these places, small islands in the Caribbean, places in Asia, whatever. They're just kicking these guys out. And you have to look at this and you say, if your banking system is the one that the rest of the world requires in order to send money back and forth to each other, and you don't let the rest of the world participate in your banking system, then how long can you possibly be, how long can you possibly be at the center of the banking system when you're actively going and kicking people out of your own system? I mean, it's absurd when you think about it. This is something that's required. You have to have this system so that these banks can basically send money to each other, and you're not letting them do it. If you don't let them do it, then they just find their own solution. They say, okay, fine, the New York banks don't want to deal with me. Let's set it up in Shanghai. Let's set it up somewhere else. Let's set it up in Hong Kong. And we'll talk about that. But these banks are going out of their way and saying, well, we don't want to accept you. They're not accepting banks, and make it impossible to get one of these accounts set up. They're kicking out old customers. It's absolutely ridiculous. The next thing we want to talk about is destroying your government balance sheet. So if you want to destroy your banking system, right, you can be poorly capitalized, you can destroy your currency, destroy your central bank, use your rating agencies for political gain, kick other banks out of your system. You also want to destroy your government balance sheet because, again, it's all about credibility. And if the government is, the central bank and the government are sort of at the top of the food chain there, and they have to maintain credibility. We've talked about this so many times before. The U.S. government is in debt up to its eyeballs, beyond its eyeballs, future generations' eyeballs. $17.5 trillion in official debt. Of course, it goes far, far beyond that. When the U.S. government's own, their internal accounting, the GAO issues these financial statements. The GAO adds up all of the assets of the federal government and subtracts its liabilities. The net worth of the federal government is minus $16.9 trillion. This is not something that inspires confidence. That's well beyond 100% of GDP. This is not a number that inspires any confidence at all, and it gets worse and worse and worse and worse every year. You want to destroy your banking system, destroy your government balance sheet. That's exactly what they're doing. The other thing you want to do is bail out the bankers at everybody else's expense. This is something that generally doesn't give depositors a whole lot of confidence. We saw this is something that actually happened in Cyprus. Very interesting. What happened in Cyprus. This was about a year ago. You may remember we've talked about this a number of times. In Cyprus, everybody went to bed. It was a Friday night. Everything was fine. They woke up the next morning. Turns out, oh, the banking system is actually insolvent. And the government went and froze everybody's accounts and seized some people's funds to bail out the banks and so forth. I mean, it was just absurd. The banks were all insolvent, right? The banks had been lying to their customers because customers could log on. You could log on to your bank account. You go online, check your balance. You'd see a number. You say, "Oh, hey, great. I got whatever. I got 20,000 euros in my account. Cool." And you could look at that and see that that the money's there. That's what the bank was telling you. By displaying the account balance, the bank is telling you your money's here. Your money's safe. We have your money. It turns out they didn't have the money. They didn't have the money. The banks were insolvent. They did not have the money. There's a word for that. It's called fraud. And fraud is bad. Fraud is illegal. And so what happened when the fraud was found out, what did the government do? Did they arrest the fraudsters? Did they punish the fraudsters? No. They punished the victims. Right? They punished the victims. They took all the people who had been defrauded and they said, well, we're going to screw you guys so we can bail out the criminals. We're going to bail out the people that lied to you at your own expense. Is this something that gives anybody confidence in the banking system? Is there anybody who is foolish enough to ever put a penny in Cyprus anymore ever again? It would be crazy, right? And yet, similar things have happened in the United States. Obviously, the banks were all bailed out. They didn't seize anybody's deposits. directly. Of course, they've been inflating all the deposits away. They've been making whatever the value of the. Essentially, what they've been doing is they have been ensuring that inflation-adjusted, tax-adjusted interest rates are negative. If you hold money in a bank account in the United States, you hold your savings in a bank account, you're losing money every year. The amount in your savings account is able to buy less than it was able to buy the year before. Okay, that's theft. Because where does that money end up going? It ends up going in the pockets of the bankers. So they have bailed out the bankers. They have indebted future generations to do this. You know, they bail these guys out, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that they didn't have. That ends up, they had to borrow it. It's debt, and that's debt that has to be paid off by future generations. People that haven't even been born yet bailed out the bankers. And everybody else that has a bank account, has savings in the United States, is suffering through essentially negative interest rates. You're losing purchasing power, all that so they could bail out the bankers. This is not something that inspires confidence. Again, in Cyprus, they just did it more directly. They bailed out the criminals and used the victims to do that. I mean, it's insane. That itself is an even higher level of criminality. But this is a great way. Again, you destroy confidence in your banking system when you do this by bailing out bankers and sort of screwing depositors in the process. This is not something that inspires confidence. This is something that destroys your banking system. Another great way to do it is to be a total hypocrite. This is one of my favorites. Of course, you know, when you go around the world and you bully people and say, "Oh, you island chain, you know, the Asian country, you know, you're a tax haven. You're a tax haven. Shame, shame, shame on you. You know, we're going to shut you down. We're going to put you on a blacklist, or we're going to put it on a gray list, or whatever color list we're going to come up with. And we're going to all these broke Western nations who are completely insolvent. We're all going to gang up on you because you don't charge any taxes, and so you're wrong and you're evil. And you know, we're going to shut you down." Well, turns out that the United States is actually the #1 tax haven in the world. If you're not an American, if you're Russian, or you're Italian, or you're basically from anywhere else on the planet, except for maybe Canada, but pretty much the U.S. is the #1 tax haven in the world. They talk about, you know, all these secret companies and all these things, and people stash away money overseas and you know, with these corporate, you know, shares that you don't have to disclose your name or so. Yeah, guess where you can do that? The United States. You know, anybody can, you know, if you're French or you're Italian or you're Russian or something like that, you can go and set up an LLC in dozens of states in the United States. You can set up something in Florida, you can set up something in Delaware, you can set up all kinds of things, and nobody's ever going to know who you are. You know, you can set up a New Mexico, Wyoming, Nevada company. Nobody's going to know who you are. There's no direct connection to you. You set up a bank account, you've got money stashed away there, nobody's ever going to know. Okay, so they go around and they point their finger at everybody else and say, "Shame on you, Hong Kong. Shame on you, Dubai. Shame on you, you know, island chain wherever in the Caribbean or the South Pacific." But they're complete hypocrites, because the U.S. is by far and away the #1 tax haven on the planet. This is, again, not something that really inspires confidence. This is the sort of thing, hypocrisy is something that people don't really appreciate, and when you're a total hypocrite, it doesn't do your banking system any favors. Of course, passing insane regulation and demanding compliance from the rest of the world, this probably takes the cake more than anything. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with you today, because today is the deadline. The deadline. It's not a deadline you might have heard about, but it's a deadline that a lot of banks around the world certainly have heard about, and maybe some who haven't. If they hadn't heard about it, they're going to suffer the consequences, because the U.S. government's going to come after them. It just makes me laugh. Let me tell you about this. This is called the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, or FATCA. F-A-T-C-A. You'll see a lot of people who really don't know what they're talking about call it F-A-C-T-A, but it's F-A-T-C-A, FATCA. FATCA was a bill that was passed. It's a law in the United States. It was passed some years ago. We've talked about it a number of times. In case you're brand new to this, that's okay. I'm going to explain it to you with an analogy that I like. Imagine that the government of Saudi Arabia, the king of Saudi Arabia, decreed that no grocery store chain in the United States could sell pork to any Muslims. All right? That would be kind of crazy, right? I think if you were in the United States, you'd think, wait a minute, that's, you know, who cares? Who cares what the king of Saudi Arabia has to say? Well, and how arrogant is this guy to think that he can pass a law and expect all these U.S. grocery stores, to abide by his law in Saudi Arabia? Forget about that guy. Who cares? Well, that's what FATCA is. FATCA is a law that requires banks around the world to enter into information sharing agreements with the IRS. It also requires U.S. Taxpayers with certain foreign accounts and so forth to provide additional disclosures above and beyond the disclosures they're already making, to provide additional disclosures about accounts that you may have overseas. But for banks, again, this is something where the banks look at this and they said, "Wait a minute, what? I have to do what? I have to jump in bed with the IRS? Are you kidding me?" And this is something that caused shockwaves across the financial system when they passed this law. What's more is that if banks don't comply, then there, of course, are penalties. And the penalties are that, there's withholding taxes. Basically, they threaten banks, foreign banks, with a 30% withholding rate. If they don't comply, then certain funds that pass through the United States banking system essentially can be withheld. 30% of that money can be withheld if the bank is out of compliance, if the bank is not in compliance with FATCA. This is insane. And the reason this is, but they can do this, right? They can pass this insane regulation, and they can demand that every bank in the world. So if you're a bank in Bangladesh who's never seen an American ever, you have to sign up for this information sharing agreement. And if you don't, then the IRS is going to force any bank to withhold 30%. So every bank in the world has to simultaneously know which other bank in the world is or is not in compliance with FATCA. I mean, how ridiculous is that? It is the dumbest thing ever. It is the most arrogant piece of legislation I think ever passed, ever. And yet, the deadline is today. The deadline for banks to sign up with the IRS is today, Monday, May 5th. The reason that's important is because there's no chance that's going to happen. If you think for a if the U.S. government thinks for a second that all these banks around the world are going to sign up, they're really kidding themselves. The deadline for when it actually starts is July 1st. So basically, as of July 1st this year, banks who aren't signed up with FATCA have to their funds have to be withheld by the other banks who are signed up with FATCA. So basically, what the U.S. government is doing is it's sort of whipping all these other banks to gang up and gang up against the other banks that are out of compliance. I mean, it is so absurd. In every single bank, I have bankers tell me their direct quote. They say, "We are shit scared." This is what they tell me. And they're so terrified of the IRS. They're so terrified of the U.S. government. Again, this is how you destroy your banking system, right? You demand compliance through fear and intimidation, not cooperation, not by adding value, but by terrorizing people, by terrorizing banks and terrorizing customers and terrorizing your own citizen. This is how you demand compliance. And the only reason you can even demand that compliance to begin with is because your banking system is, the pinnacle of the world banking. It's the centerpiece of the banking system. Without your banking system, no banking around the world can function. And so the U.S. government is in the position to demand compliance because they have this sort of ace in the hole, right? Because they say, hey, well, if the rest of the world doesn't comply, we'll shut you out of our banking system. And so everybody says, oh, man, we can't get shut out of the U.S. banking system, because if we get shut out of the U.S. banking system, then we won't be able to transact business around the world. So everybody's, again, my friends tell me, shit scared. This is what the bankers say. Everybody's terrified. It's terror, it's fear, it's intimidation. This is how these people do business. This is how governments regulate and demand compliances, through fear and intimidation. This is exactly how you destroy your banking system. Probably actually the most ridiculous thing about it is that now what the IRS is supposed to do is they're supposed to create a list. Starting July 1st, they're going to have this list. Of course, we all know about government lists, right? So they're going to have this list, this special list of all the banks that are in compliance. So now, every time banks send money to one another, you got this bank in Bangladesh sending money to these guys in Colombia, whatever, right? They have to check the list, make sure the bank in Bangladesh isn't on the list, or the bank in Colombia isn't on the list, and make sure everything's okay. And actually, it's not even it's the list of people who have complied, right? So the list that the IRS puts out is they say, here's everybody who has complied, and we presume everybody else to be guilty, right? So it's not a kind of an innocent until proven guilty. It's a you're presumed guilty until you're on this list. Until you can prove to us that you're innocent, we're going to presume that you're guilty, and we're going to shut you out of the banking system, and we're going to take 30% of your money, right? This is, I mean, it's just a textbook way of exactly how you would go out of your way. If you wanted to destroy your banking system, this is exactly what you would do. You would go and you would force everybody with fear and terror and intimidation to comply with some absurd regulation that is completely unnecessary, which, by the way, you only issued because you're a complete hypocrite, right? This is exactly how you destroy your banking system. And what happens if the U.S. banking system is not in the same position? The U.S. banking system is not the #1 banking system in the world anymore. The dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, and so forth. All these things are completely interconnected. These are not isolated things. The debt, the dollar, the banking system, all this stuff, they're all in bed with each other. They're all in bed with each other. This is the holy trinity of the global financial system. It is critically important to understand. If the U.S. banking system, if the U.S. banking system is destroying itself, which is exactly what's happening, it's not that hard to come up with another one, right? It's not that hard to go. This is a picture of HSBC in Hong Kong. There's no reason why Hong Kong can't be, the center of the global banking system. There's no reason why Singapore can't be the center, or why Dubai or any of these places can't be the center of the global banking system. This is pretty easy stuff to set up that infrastructure. This is 2014. Setting up, innovative banking structure. It's a question of software. It's a question of internet infrastructure. This isn't really a big deal. We're not selling telegraphs in Pony Express. I mean, this stuff was a long time ago. This is a pretty easy thing to do. All it takes is banks setting up other accounts with each other. So if a bunch of banks go and set up accounts, in Hong Kong instead of in the United States, then guess what? Hong Kong becomes the new global banking system. Hong Kong becomes the center of the new global bank system. I mean, it really isn't rocket science. It's so easy to change, and there's so many countries out there that are really pushing for this, really pushing for this, because they look at this thing. The U.S. is really going out of its way to terrorize people and to destroy itself. Why do we still have this as the center of the banking system anymore? I'm tired of this. And when that happens, suddenly the dollar becomes less important. Suddenly the U.S. government becomes less important, and suddenly, again, all this stuff just turns into wallpaper. This is if you're not looking at the video, this is actually a picture of Zimbabwe dollars. It says, thanks to Mugabe, this money is wallpaper. These used to be Zimbabwe dollars. Of course, Zimbabwe doesn't even actually have its own currency anymore. They just did away with it because after they hyperinflated into the trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions, what's the point? And I've been to Zimbabwe a couple of times. You still see these guys that have bricks and bricks of cash, and they use it. They put a little some little cloth over it, and they use it as like a coffee table. I mean, just bricks of cash that they used to have to put in a wheelbarrow just to go, buy a loaf of bread and their weekly groceries. And so this is the sort of thing. I'm not saying the dollar is going to hyperinflate tomorrow or anything. What I am saying is that the U.S. is going out of its way to destroy its banking system. It is not terribly difficult to create an alternative banking system. And when that happens, that really accelerates the decline, because suddenly they no longer have the ability, they can't push the world around, they can't push their debt on anybody anymore. All this stuff changes dramatically. If the U.S. is no longer the center of the banking system, the dollar becomes less important. If the dollar becomes less important, then U.S. treasuries become less important. If U.S. treasuries become less important, then who is the U.S. government going to pawn all of its debt onto? It's a good question. It's a good question. Obviously, there are a lot of great possibilities out there, including individual retirement accounts in the United States, U.S. bank accounts, retirees, all sorts of things. All sorts of things to grab. Which is why, we continually talk about the need to, diversify yourself overseas, put your seatbelt on. We talked about this, I think, in our last podcast. You need to put your seatbelt on. You don't put your seatbelt on after the wreck, after the collision occurs. You put your seatbelt on when you get in the car. We can look all around the world and see there's a lot of risk out there. We can look at this banking system. This is just an absurd, deceitful banking system, and it is on the way down. It is on the way out. There's actually already a lot of statistics out there showing that a lot of sort of foreign financial direct investment is going far more into places like Singapore than it is going into London or New York. So all this data is all out there. This isn't some conspiracy theory. This is just rational, objective analysis based on publicly available data. Anybody can see this stuff. This isn't black magic or voodoo or anything here. This is just being rational. And we can see this if the banking system is being destroyed, if the credibility is being destroyed, there are consequences from that. And if we know there are consequences out there, it makes all the sense in the world to take some common sense, basic precautions. Just like putting on your seatbelt. We know there are consequences out on the road. It makes all the sense in the world to just buckle your seatbelt when you get in the car. Because even if you make it from point A to point B and nothing happens, you're not going to be worse off. You know, when you drive from your house to the grocery store and you don't get into a wreck, you're not going to get to the grocery store and say, man, I wish I hadn't been wearing my seatbelt. Of course, it doesn't matter. It takes 2 seconds. It's effortless. And so is considering moving a portion of your savings overseas out of that banking system that's destroying itself and into a new banking system. It is not, you're not going to be worse off for doing that. You're not going to be worse off for considering a lot of these solutions that we talk about routinely in all of our different products and services. I know if you're a member of Sovereign Confidential, or if you've purchased Sovereign Starter or any of our other our Masterclass, any of our other really great comprehensive products, I hope you understand this by now. You're not going to be worse off for doing that. If you haven't done that yet, I really encourage you to do that. There are really a lot of great solutions out there. Again, we can see all the risks that are out there. And this isn't, you know, look, this isn't the end of the world. The world's not coming to an end. We can see that this, you know, this fiat-based financial system and, you know, a political system where a tiny handful of people gets to go and in debt future generations, all that stuff's on the way out. Whether it happens today or tomorrow or 18 months or 5 years from now, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter when. It just we can probably get a pretty good understanding that it's going to happen. Just like we could probably realize that at some point we might get into an accident down the road. So it's why it's so important to just do something basic and simple. You know, make sure your vehicle is well maintained. Make sure you have insurance on your car. Wear your seatbelt. All these things are things that make sense no matter what. So I really definitely encourage folks, because these things change. These things change a lot. The right banking options, you know, they can change. One day, you know, you're able to open up an account, and the next day, you know, with a stroke of a pen, they say, no, we can't do this anymore. You know, laws change, you know, things for all the things we talk about, applying for, you know, residency in a place overseas, just so you know you can have a place to go in case you need to. These laws change from time to time. Politicians get elected, they change laws. All these things happen from time to time. That's why it's so important to put your seatbelt on now. Now, while you can. It's easy. Just reach over your shoulder and click it into place. Okay, and there are a lot of options out there right now. I would definitely encourage you to take advantage of those options. The biggest reason why is because nobody else is doing it. Very few people are doing this right now. I mean, we have this couple 100,000 people who read Notes from the Field, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are members of Sovereign Confidential, and it's great, but come on, there's hundreds of millions of people in North America. There's hundreds of millions of people in Europe. So this is a tiny, tiny fraction of the population. Imagine if all of a sudden, instead of, we're talking hundreds or thousands of people try and do this and move into a new bank or try and establish residency or something like that. Imagine if all of a sudden it's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people who all of a sudden realize, wait a minute, this is a total scam. I have to get out of the dollar. I have to get out of this bank. Imagine what happens then when everybody all at the same time is rushing for the exit. You know, do you want to be caught up in that crowd? I would argue that you probably don't want to be caught up in that crowd, because anytime you're in the crowd, you're going to get caught up, the doors are going to slam shut, and you're going to be trapped inside. This is definitely the time to do that. It's time to put your seatbelt on now while you can, without any distractions. All the opportunities are out there. I definitely want to encourage you to do that. So I've said my piece. Appreciate you guys listening. We're going to have a lot more. I got a lot more interesting things to say. We want to talk about Russia and Ukraine and all that. But we'll do that next time. So thanks for listening. Thanks for being a reader and a listener. We'll talk to you again soon.